Boldwood presents Under a Riviera Moon, written by Helen McGinn and read by Helen Stern. Chapter 1. Present Day. On the floor in 5, if that's okay with you. Maggie addressed the young man in the makeup chair. He nodded without looking up, eyes fixed on the phone in his hand. Behind him, the makeup artist rolled her eyes dramatically. Maggie winked at her. Great. See you out there. It was almost 7 in the morning, and they were already behind schedule. Rehearsals were due to start any moment, and so far, only one presenter had turned up. Maggie called for her assistant producer, a frighteningly confident 20-something, with perfect skin, hair, teeth and nails. Maggie hoped the bronzer she'd applied before leaving the flat was going some way to reassuring people that she wasn't, in fact, dead. Any sign? The 20-something shook her head. I'm going to send one of the runners to the hotel. She's not picking up, and I can't get hold of her agent either. You're probably not going to like this, but look. Maggie squinted at the phone screen being held in front of her to see a picture of the presenter in question coming out of a well-known London nightclub looking worse for wear. Seriously? Maggie glanced at her watch. We're not live for another hour or so. We'll just have to start rehearsals without her. Put her straight into the dressing room when she gets here, and let me know as soon as she does. Got it. Sometimes Maggie felt more like a glorified babysitter than a TV producer. An award-winning one at that. Almost 2 decades in the business, and even when she thought she'd seen it all, so-called talent still managed to surprise her with their behaviour. I'll go and have a word with Max and give him the heads up that he might be doing this one alone. Maggie made her way back to the makeup room, her best, everything is under control look firmly on her face. The one thing she didn't want anyone to do was panic. Not yet, anyway. 20 minutes later, the one presenter they had in the building was running through rehearsals for the low-budget Saturday morning children's entertainment show Maggie had fallen into producing, whilst in between other jobs. Creating rehearse chaos on a weekly basis was exhausting, and the frighteningly early starts really didn't help matters. Sitting in the dark room in the gallery, the wall of screens in front of her capturing every angle of the action taking place on the studio floor, Maggie watched as the lone presenter went from camera to camera, reading the auto cue and delivering every word perfectly. He might not be very likeable in real life, but Maggie had to admit, this one was pretty good. She's here. I've put her straight into makeup. Maggie turned to see another runner at the door. Thanks, I'll be there in a minute. How is she? The runner grimaced. That bad, huh? Maggie stood up, grabbed her coffee, and made her way back across the studio to the makeup room. She knocked on the door, opening it slowly. The chair swiveled round to reveal a young woman curled up in a camel-coloured velour tracksuit, sunglasses on her face, hair piled up on top of her head in a messy bun. Hey, Max. The woman's voice was gravelly, her late night obviously having taken its toll. Susie, what happened to you? Maggie turned the chair back round to face the mirror. Susie took off her sunglasses. Nothing. She tried to smile, but her face crumpled and she started to cry. Maggie turned to the makeup artist. Can you give us a minute? She whispered. Once the door closed, Maggie stood behind the chair and looked at Susie in the mirror. You know I can't put you out there in this state. She spoke softly. Years of experience had taught her that the best way to handle this sort of situation was as calmly as possible. No matter what, there was a show to be made. Maggie, please. I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened last night. I swear I wasn't even drinking. Susie spoke between sobs. Maggie reached forward and pulled out a tissue from a box on the counter, passing it to her. Listen, I know you love this job and you're good at it. Very good, to be honest. but you can't do it like this. So I'm going to send you home now, say you're not well. Next week, you are going to be here and deliver the best show you've ever done. And you won't ever do this again. Agreed?" The young woman nodded, her eyes falling to the sodden tissue she held in her hand. "Good. Now go home, sleep it off, and we'll speak on Monday." Maggie squeezed her shoulder gently. "I'll get someone to order you a cab." "Thank you," whispered Susie. "It won't happen again. I promise you." "I know it won't. Go before anyone else sees you. And it might be a good idea to stay in tonight, too." Susie nodded. "I've got to go." Maggie turned and left the room. Before she'd even closed the door, someone else was asking for her on the floor. She spoke into her headset. "There in a moment." By the time she got back in the studio, all hell had broken loose. People were standing on chairs and tables, and the children, who'd been sitting watching from the sofa when Maggie had last seen them, were now screaming hysterically. "What's going on?" Maggie surveyed the scene. Her assistant producer looked utterly panic-stricken. "One of the kids opened the cage backstage, the one with the pet rats in." Maggie instantly looked down at her feet, wondering why she'd agreed to the feature in the first place. She hated rats. She called for the floor manager, an unflappable man called Gary, who'd been in the business even longer than she had. He soon appeared from behind the bank of cameras, brandishing a broom. "Where's the guy in charge of the bloody things?" Maggie continued scanning the floor for rodents. "He was outside having a fag, apparently," said Gary. "Right, get the kids out of here. We've got—" Maggie glanced at her watch again. "About half an hour before we need the floor cleared." Gary nodded. "You know what they say, Maggie." "If you say anything about children and animals, Gary, I swear to God." "I wouldn't dare. We'll get it sorted." Maggie made her way back to the gallery, slipping into the darkness of the room. Out on the studio floor, people heard your every word, saw your every move. Not even a whisper went unnoticed. But in the gallery, the madness was on the other side of the screen. Here, you could hide away from everything. Sometimes it felt like she'd watched her own life from a gallery, seeing events unfold from afar. If only she could go back and give the younger Maggie direction, speaking gently into her ear. The problem was, younger Maggie wouldn't have listened. She thought she knew it all back then. What was it they said about the arrogance of youth? At least you were full of optimism, fearless of what lay ahead. Now she'd been knocked about by life, had the tales to prove it. She looked at the monitors, watching the carnage. The urge to walk out was strong, but Maggie knew she couldn't leave everyone in the lurch. It was bad enough already, and in any case, the television world was a very small place. One bad job, and your name was mud. She'd seen it happen to others, and it wasn't a pretty sight. Somehow, they got through the morning and made it to the end of the live show without too many hitches. Everything that could have gone wrong had done so in rehearsals. What's more, the young presenter had really pulled it out of the bag, managing to hold the show together without his usual co-host. Maggie thought about Susie, wondered if her earlier warning would sink in, but it was out of her hands now. She tried to skip the usual post-show drinks in the local pub round the corner from the studio, her early start having caught up with her. All she really wanted to do was head home to her flat, put on a tracksuit, and curl up on the sofa with a good book for the afternoon. But Gary was having none of it, roping her in to join the rest of the crew just for one drink. An hour and a half later, and on her third gin and tonic, Maggie found herself sitting on a stool at one end of the bar, listening to Lottie, one of the researchers on the show. She was pouring her heart out about her current dilemma involving her flatmate, who she clearly loved, and the flatmate's boyfriend, who she clearly didn't, and whether it was right or not to let a friend know if you didn't like their partner. "I'd say it depends on how close you are," said Maggie, reaching for the open packet of crisps on the bar. "What you don't want to do is say something uninvited. If she asks your opinion, then you should tell her the truth. But otherwise, unless you think there's something seriously wrong with them, It's dangerous ground. Maggie took a sip of her drink. Are you speaking from experience? The young woman looked at Maggie, raising an eyebrow as she did so. At my age, everything is spoken from experience. How old are you? I'm 40 next month. Oh! Maggie laughed. You think that's old? No, I just... Lottie shifted on her seat. What's your story, Maggie? What do you mean? Maggie was taken aback by her question. Astute, yes, but unexpectedly direct, especially from someone so much younger than her. I mean just that. How long have we been doing this show together? 3 months? And I don't know anything about you. Are you always this nosy? Maggie smiled, amused by Lottie's approach. What can I say? I'm a researcher. I was born nosy. Lottie shrugged her shoulders. Maggie thought about it for a few seconds before speaking. There were 2 ways she could answer this question. The first was honestly, but that also meant going into the details, and she wasn't ready to do that. She'd barely been able to process what had happened to her in the last few years, let alone talk to someone she didn't really know about it. Reminding herself she now had a fair bit of gin in her system, she decided against that first option, and instead she went with the second. There's not much to tell, to be honest. Pretty standard, I'd say. How did you get into TV? By accident. Lottie laughed. Definitely standard. I trained as a lawyer, actually. Really? Maggie looked a little embarrassed. Yep, I know. I was all set for a life as a corporate lawyer, finished my training and everything. I started my first job, and after about 3 months, I knew I'd made a huge mistake. I just couldn't spend the rest of my working life behind a desk, arguing on someone else's behalf. I had to do something else, but I didn't have a clue what that was. I was waitressing to earn some money when an opportunity came up to help on a TV show. One of the other waiters had worked in a production and asked if I'd be interested. I took it, desperate to do something. 20 years later, here we are. And you've worked your way up to producing? Lottie's eyes glistened. Maggie nodded. Took a while, and I've done some terrible jobs in my time. But yes, that's essentially it. Persistence is key. That and a bit of luck. Being in the right place at the right time. Now I can't imagine doing anything else. How about you? What are you planning after this job? No idea. Lottie took a large gulp of her drink. Don't get me wrong, this is fun, but I want to be a writer. I'm working on my own stuff, hoping to put on a play next year. Really? What kind of play? Well, I haven't written it yet. Work in progress, you know. Maggie looked at the young, clearly ambitious woman. For a moment, she longed to swap places and be the one with her life ahead of her. The list of things she'd do differently was long. For a start, she wouldn't have spent so many years trying to save her marriage. Hey, are you okay? Maggie glanced up to see Lottie looking at her, her face concerned. Oh, yes, sorry, I was miles away. I think there's more to your story than you're letting on. Lottie lowered her voice. Maggie nodded slowly. There is. I'm just not ready to tell it yet. She put her hand on Lottie's arm and squeezed it gently. But thank you for asking. She quickly wiped at a tear that threatened to fall, then smiled back. I think I'm going to get going. I've already stayed way longer than I meant to. You sure I can't get you another? Maggie slipped off the stool and hooked her bag over her shoulder. Thanks, but honestly I can't. I've got plans later, so see you next week. As she crossed the park on her way to the tube station, Maggie felt a rush of guilt. She didn't have plans. In fact, it had been months since she'd socialised at all outside work. Not seeing people was just easier for now. No need to pretend she was fine. The September sun shone brightly. People passed, chatting and laughing. Groups sat on the grass, the debris of their long-gone picnics around them. Everyone was seemingly still in summer mode as far as Maggie could tell. She tried to look on the upside of having an evening all to herself. She could have a long bath, read her book, watch anything she wanted, eat whatever she fancied. Maybe she should go and see an old film at the cinema, like she used to with Jack. Her old life, the one where she was married to someone she loved and who loved her right back. In a split second she was there, remembering the way he would look at her, telling her they could get through anything. By the time Maggie got to her front door, she was holding back tears, biting her lip hard to stop them falling. She got inside as fast as she could, not wanting to bump into any of her neighbours. Before walking up the stairs to her flat, she picked up the small pile of posts that had been left for her, too distraught to notice the handwritten envelope on the top. Once inside, she shut the door, dropped her bag on the floor, and went into the kitchen to make herself a cup of tea. She opened the sash window, and within seconds, Tiger, her beloved cat, appeared on the windowsill, meowing loudly. "Oh, don't give me that," said Maggie, stroking him under the chin. "You didn't miss me at all." He began to purr as she tipped some of his food into a bowl and put it on the floor. "There you go, you dirty stop-out." She watched as he weaved between her ankles before sniffing the food and turning his nose up. "You have to be kidding me. That stuff cost a small fortune." Tiger looked up at her disdainfully. She flicked the switch on the kettle, scanning the back gardens of her neighbours below as she waited for it to boil. Next door, a couple of children shrieked with delight as they bounced on a trampoline. On the other side, an elderly couple tended to their immaculate flower beds. Maggie had been in the flat for a few months and was yet to meet any of her neighbours properly. In their old house, she'd known the people on both sides well, but here, everyone seemed to keep to themselves. Tiger nudged her arm, having jumped up onto the kitchen counter. Maggie looked at her cat, his head raised in expectation, eyes closed. She tickled him gently as a sound of water on a rolling boil filled the kitchen. Taking her tea to the sofa, Maggie sat down, a pile of posts in her lap. She discarded the flyers advertising various food delivery services and was left with a white envelope, her mother's writing on the front. She loved the fact that despite modern technology, her mother wrote to her at least once a month with news from home. She opened the letter, reading it as she slowly sipped her tea. There were the usual updates, the weather, what had been happening on the farm. She turned the page to see her mother's familiar signature. She thought of home, the old farmhouse she grew up in. She imagined her parents in the kitchen, sitting in their usual chairs at the kitchen table, a fire going in the grate. Suddenly, she wanted to be back there. Reaching for her phone, she typed out a message on the family WhatsApp she'd insisted on setting up, knowing her father would see it, even if her mother didn't. "I thought I might come back for a few days. Have you got any plans? Kiss." She pressed send. A few moments later, her phone pinged on the table. She picked it up and read the message on the screen. "We can't wait to see you. Dad. Kiss." Maggie sighed. Yes, it was time to go home. Chapter 2. Present day. Maggie had woken early and was on the road well before most, especially on a Sunday. Tiger had protested at being put in his cage at first, but settled quickly once on the passenger seat. Maggie packed her laptop so she could stay on top of things whilst away, but she wasn't due back in the studio until Friday. It felt like a mini-break. Not that visiting her parents really counted as a mini-break, but for now, familiar surroundings were all Maggie wanted. Hitting shuffle on her current favourite playlist, a mix of folk, rock anthems and some classic hip-hop thrown in for good measure, Maggie set off on the familiar route feeling better than she had done for a while. Getting out of the city was like coming up for air. As she left the suburbs and hit open motorway, she lost herself in the music, singing loudly. Every now and again, Tiger would make his presence known with a paw through the cage door to get Maggie's attention. She stopped for coffee after a few hours, then again for a sandwich and a packet of crisps a few hours after that, before pushing on through the Northumberland landscape with its big skies and finally into the Scottish borders. Catching her first sight of Eildon Hill as she made her way towards her hometown of Melrose always made her feel like a kid again. Along with her parents, she'd walked that hill almost every Sunday morning as a child, and seeing the outline on the horizon never failed to transport her back to that time in an instant. Crossing the River Tweed over the old stone bridge, she wound her way up the hill on the other side and turned off the road onto the track leading to the farm. The sun was still bright, just a few clouds in the sky. The house came into view, its whitewashed walls and bright blue door looking exactly as it always did. The last of the roses hung around the door frame, and as Maggie pulled the car up in front of the house, out came her mother. Dressed in her familiar uniform of jeans, an old white cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and a clay-splattered navy apron over the top, she wore a beaming smile on her face. A small black and white Jack Russell and an old black Labrador followed close behind. Maggie opened the car door. "Hey, Mum." "Darling, you must be exhausted. Come inside. I've just put the kettle on. All good?" "I'm fine, Mum, thank you." She got out and hugged her mother. "It's so lovely to be home." Her mother hugged her back hard. "We've missed you. We've been worried about you." "I know you have. I'm sorry, I just got busy with work." "Did you get my last letter?" Her mother looked at Maggie, smiling hopefully. "I did, thank you. I love your letters, Mum. I think you might be one of the only people left who writes them." Her mother looked her daughter straight in the eye. "How are you doing?" Maggie nodded. "Getting there." She reached down and stroked the Labrador, now leaning against her legs. "Hey, Juno." There was a loud meow from the passenger seat. Maggie went round to open the door. "Let me bring Tiger in. He'll be happy enough once he's back in your kitchen." They chatted as Maggie's mother made up a tray with a pot of tea, a jug of milk, and 3 mugs. Maggie sat watching from the old kitchen table, covered in the usual debris of books, old newspapers, and a pot filled with pencils and pens. It always amused Maggie that her mother, a celebrated ceramicist and something of a local celebrity, prized that pot Maggie had made for her many years ago at school over anything she'd made herself. Maggie's father appeared at the door, still in his farm overalls. "Sylvie, you didn't tell me Margaret was here." "Michael, how many times do I have to ask you not to come in here in those boots? They're filthy." Sylvie threw him a look. Maggie got up and went to her father. "Hi, Dad." He hugged his daughter, then held her face in his hands before kissing her forehead. "Let me get these boots off before she banishes me." Her father rolled his eyes and laughed. "Is that tea?" "It is. Do you want some cake?" Sylvie reached for a battered old biscuit tin on the side. "Oh, yes, please," chorused father and daughter. They sat eating fruitcake with their fingers as they caught up on Maggie's news. She told them about her latest job, including the disastrous morning she'd had the day before. "When does that finish?" Her father spoke through a mouthful of cake. "I've just finished, so I've got a bit of a break before the next one." Maggie wrapped her fingers around her mug. "There's a job that's come up. It's a 2-month project, but I think Jack might be working on it too, so I haven't committed yet." "Isn't that a bit unfair?" Her mother looked at Maggie, one eyebrow raised. Maggie sighed. "It's just the way it goes, Mum. We always knew this would happen. We work in the same industry." "But why can't you take the job and Jack find something else?" Maggie's father bristled. "Dad, honestly, it's not a problem. We'll work it out as we go. I'm not sure I'd want to take it anyway. The job involves pop stars from the 90s competing to get back into the charts with a live show every Saturday night. I swore never again after the last time I did something like that, so I'll only take it if nothing else comes up, which it usually does. Touch wood." Maggie put her fingers on the kitchen table, feeling the familiar grooves in the wood under her fingertips. The hours they'd spent round that table as a family. The three of them, but always with people coming and going. Over the years, various friends, often fellow artists, had come to stay for a few days and would still be there a month or so later. At times, it felt like a commune. Maggie loved it, and being an only child, she'd never had to vie for attention. There was always someone to talk to in the kitchen. "I'm sure it will," said her mother, reaching for Maggie's empty plate. "Another slice?" "If it's all right with you, I might just walk down to the river after that drive." Maggie got up from her chair, attracting the attention of the two dogs curled up in a basket by the range cooker. She looked at them. "You heard the word walk, didn't you?" "Oh, do take them. They'd love that." Sylvie gathered the empty mugs and walked to the sink. "Michael, did you take that pie out of the freezer?" "I think so. Let me go and check." "Just to take it out and put it on the top?" Sylvie waited until he'd left the room. He's getting so forgetful. "How is he?" Maggie leant against the wall, watching her father through the large kitchen window as he crossed the yard to the barn. "Not too bad, all things considered, but we do have to keep an eye on it. Regular checkups, that sort of thing." Neither wanted to say the word dementia out loud, but it sat there, like an unwanted guest. "You will tell me when it gets worse, won't you?" "He's all right, really. As long as he's here at home with me, he's happy. There is something I need to talk to you about, though. I was going to tell you in my next letter, but now you're here, it makes things a bit easier." "What is it?" Maggie felt panic rise in her chest. "Nothing bad, don't worry." Her mother gestured for Maggie to sit back down. "I got a letter recently from an old friend of my mother's. I've not heard from her for years, not since your grandmother died." She picked up a letter from a pile on the table and slipped open the envelope. Putting her glasses on, she unfolded the piece of paper carefully. "It's from a woman called Allegra. They knew each other in Paris." Maggie looked surprised. "I didn't know she lived in Paris. What was she doing there?" "Studying photography at an art college. Her parents lived there for a couple of years, and Allegra was her best friend there. American. Very glamorous by all accounts." Maggie tried to imagine her grandmother as a teenager in Paris. They'd adored each other, and Maggie used to love visiting her as a little girl, making the long journey south with her parents in the car to stay in her cottage by the sea. Widowed at a young age, her grandmother had brought up her mother for much of her life on her own. Maggie had been in her late teens when she died, and still missed her dreadfully. "What does the letter say?" "Allegra lives in France now. She left the US and retired to Cannes after her husband died, apparently. She said she's been going through some old boxes that hadn't been touched for years and found one belonging to my mother. It's got some of her photographs and her old camera. She said she thought about sending it, but wondered if we might like to go and collect it instead. Given it's obviously got sentimental value, she didn't want to just put it in the post without asking me first." Maggie's mother looked up from the words on the paper, a small smile on her face. "Obviously, I can't leave your father here on his own." "You want me to stay here and look after him?" Maggie couldn't hide the reluctance in her voice, much to her instant embarrassment. "No, Maggie. I want you to go and get it." "But surely you want to go and see her yourself, don't you?" Her mother looked out of the window. "I would love to, really. More than anything. It would be lovely to talk to her about her time with my mother, but I really can't. As I said, your father has good days and bad days, and for now, I want to be here for all of them." She sat down and reached for her daughter's hands across the table. "Darling, all I'm suggesting is that you think about it. My mother used to talk about this woman all the time. They kept in touch practically until the day your grandmother died. Allegra always found it so interesting, and she knew all the famous artists, everyone from Picasso to Warhol, apparently. You could stay for a few days. She's offering a room at her house, so it's not going to cost much more than the flight there, which, if you go, I would like to treat you to." "Mum, I haven't said I'll go yet, and even if I did, you don't have to do that." "It would be your birthday present, and besides, you'd be doing me a favour. I'm not leaving your father, so hearing all about it from you is the next best thing. I'd love to see some more of my mother's photographs. I don't know much about her time there. I've always regretted not asking her more about it when I had the chance. Maggie hadn't entertained the idea of going anywhere on holiday for a while, certainly not since her divorce. It was years since she'd had a real change of scene. But how could she drop everything and go? What about Tiger? Then the penny dropped. Was this her mother's way of getting Maggie out of her current rut without being seen to interfere? Don't overthink it, her mother said gently, squeezing Maggie's hands. Maggie gave her a sideways glance, a wry smile on her face. Don't think I'm not on to you. She stood up, the dogs immediately at her feet, all eyes on her. Back in about half an hour. Maggie kissed the top of her mother's head. See you in a bit. And can you just check your father hasn't forgotten to take that pie out on your way past? Maggie set off along the path that ran along the riverbank, both dogs walking dutifully close behind. She made her way down the familiar narrow road from the house towards the chain bridge that linked them to the Melrose side of the river. The road was lined with old oaks and thick cotton wool clouds hung low in the sky. The sun still shone, but the air was beginning to cool. Maggie looked across the dark waters of the Tweed towards the triple peaks of the Eildons beyond. She headed east along the river towards one of her favourite places, a deep holding pool on the bend. Reaching the corner, Maggie made her way across the grass to the water's edge. She picked a spot on a rock overlooking the long, deep pool and sat, watching the water as it swirled and eddied. The dogs made themselves comfortable in the long grass behind her, settling down for a late afternoon snooze. Clearly the fish weren't biting. There wasn't a fisherman to be seen, not even in the shallows further upstream. She kept her eyes on the stout-coloured water, hoping to catch a glimpse of a salmon. Before long, her mind had wandered back to the last conversation she'd had with Jack just a few months before. She'd gone over it so many times in her head, and still it didn't make sense. They'd agreed to meet for a drink, to toast their decree absolute. It had been Jack's suggestion, and had seemed like quite a good idea at the time. After all, they'd both agreed to a divorce in the first place. Saying no would have seemed churlish. And so, there they were, sitting opposite each other at a table outside a pub in Hampstead, both smiling as they raised their glasses. Hard as it was, Maggie was determined to do divorce in a civilised manner. They'd met on a TV job years before. She was an assistant producer and Jack was a cameraman. Their attraction had been instant, and 3 months later, by the end of the gig, she'd moved into his rented flat. Life went by in a blur of work, long lazy Sundays, spent mostly in bed or in the pub with friends, along with the occasional trip out of London to visit their families. After a couple of years, Jack proposed, and Maggie was over the moon. So far, so normal. After almost 3 years of marriage, on Maggie's 34th birthday, they'd been out for dinner with friends, and on the walk back home, Jack had raised the subject of starting a family. Despite worrying about temporarily losing an income, they decided the time was right. 9 months later, Maggie stood in their bathroom holding a pregnancy test in her hand. It had been the first time she'd been late since she'd stopped taking her contraception pills, and she braced herself for the moment she'd seen in so many films, the one where she'd walk out of the bathroom and silently show him the stick, waiting for him to see the thin blue line. He would then look at her, a mix of wonder and disbelief. She'd slowly nod, then smile. Instead, she stood alone in the bathroom, willing the test to tell her she was pregnant. It wasn't until Jack knocked gently on the door, asking if she was all right, that she realised that line wasn't going to appear, no matter how long she stood there staring at it. Almost 4 years, 3 rounds of IVF, 20 eggs and 6 embryos later, there was still no baby. Barely a moment went by when Maggie wasn't thinking about getting pregnant, and each time treatment failed, she felt the gap between the two of them widen. In that time, they went from talking about almost nothing else but having children to not being able to bring up the subject without arguing. Maggie wanted to keep trying, Jack wanted to stop. By this time, some of their friends had started having their own children. Life had changed so much, and yet Maggie was stuck where she was, unable to move forward. Unexplained infertility, they'd been told. No matter how many times Jack tried to convince her no one was to blame, Maggie felt ashamed. Somehow she'd failed. It was all her fault. Their separation happened quickly. A filming job had taken Jack away from home for 2 weeks, and both exhausted after years of disappointment and sadness, not to mention financial stress, they realised life was less painful apart than it was together. The fight in them to see it through had gone, and they both knew it. Jack moved out shortly after, and Maggie threw herself into work, accepted every invitation to go for drinks from concerned friends, and for the next few months tried her best to shut out the pain of the previous few years. And she thought she was covering it up well, right up until the point she went to visit her parents for her mother's birthday. By this time, Maggie was barely sleeping. She'd lost her appetite almost completely. As they'd sat around the kitchen table on the evening she'd arrived, sitting in familiar surroundings and without the need to put on a brave face, Maggie's defences had completely crumbled. Once she started crying, she couldn't stop. She remembered her father quietly leaving the table and returning with a small whiskey and a tumbler. Her mother simply held her hand across the table. Maggie had talked, and they'd listened without judgment. Later, she and her mother had walked along the river to the same spot Maggie was in now. She remembered how they'd sat on the rock, her mother telling her how much they loved her, and that Maggie mustn't lose faith in life. "Keep going," she'd said. "Things will get better. I promise." Maggie looked down into the deep waters before her. She'd got so used to living with a feeling of sadness, like a dull ache. Some days were worse than others. Passing babies in prams was always hard to bear, even now, and there were times when she'd wondered if she would ever feel truly happy again. But she'd held on to her mother's words, and that sadness didn't seem to hurt quite as much as it used to. She thought about her mother's request, realising it would be churlish to say no. Even if she had no idea who this woman was, it was in the south of France. At the very least, she'd be able to see a place she'd always dreamt of. And a change was as good as a rest, as her mother always liked to remind her. Then again, what if a job came up when she was away? Turning down work wasn't something she could easily afford to do. Maggie glimpsed a flash of silver underneath the surface. She could just make out the shape of a salmon resting near the bottom of the pool. She watched as it moved gently. Then, with a flick of its tail, it was gone. "Keep going," she whispered. By the time Maggie got back to the house, it was golden hour, and as ever, her parents were sitting in their usual seats in the garden overlooking the river. "Make yourself a drink. Come and join us," said her father. "I will," called Maggie. "I'm just going to grab a jumper." She went into the kitchen, the smell of their supper wafting from the range. The table had been cleared, a pile of plates with some cutlery placed on top of their faded old linen napkins at one end. She poured herself a glass of wine from the chilled bottle of Macon Village she found in the fridge door and grabbed her jumper from the back of the chair. Stepping outside to join them, she was hit by the familiar scent of lavender and lemon balm hanging in the air. "How was your walk?" Her mother lifted the brim of her old straw hat. Maggie sat on the grass between them and was soon joined by the dogs, Juno leaning against her body with his full weight as Labradors do. It was so lovely. There wasn't a soul to be seen down by the river. "See any fish?" asked her father. "One, actually. Quite big, too. Can I do anything to help?" "No, it's all done. Just keeping it warm until we're ready to eat." "Did you ever think about running that errand for me?" Her mother looked at Maggie hopefully. "Errand?" Her father raised his eyebrows. "I told you, Michael. The box of my mother's things." Sylvie smiled at him. Maggie could tell from her mother's measured tone that she'd obviously told her father more than once. "Oh yes, I remember." He nodded, but Maggie didn't think he remembered at all. "Tell me about her and Allegra again, Mum." Maggie hoped this would save her father from having to ask what she was talking about. Sylvie took a sip of her whiskey and soda. If I remember rightly, Allegra was a beautiful American, very tall with auburn hair. My mother, on the other hand, was quite short with thick dark hair. Apparently they made quite a pair. Spent most of their time hanging about in the best jazz clubs in town. Not that my mother's parents knew that, of course. Sylvie laughed. This was a time when you had all the greats playing in Paris, from John Coltrane to Charlie Parker, and my mother was mad about her music. I grew up on those jazz records, thanks to her time in Paris. Have you still got any of them? Yes, they're all in the cupboard in there. She gestured to the conservatory. Maggie loved how her parents still listened to vinyl, oblivious to how on trend they were. What brought them back here? I'm not entirely sure. I know they left quite suddenly because there was some unrest in the city. There were lots of protests going on at the time. Student protests. Maggie sat back on her elbows, stretching her legs out on the grass. No, this was a few years before the student uprising. Something to do with the Algerian War. I know she was devastated to leave. She adored Paris. Where are you going, Michael? Put one of those records on. I'll turn the speaker into the garden. Not too loud, darling. We don't want to upset the neighbours again. Maggie's mother called after him. Last time I went out in the evening and left him alone, the neighbours on both sides messaged me to ask what was going on. I got home to find the Allman Brothers blasting from the speakers. I don't think he realised how loud it was. They weren't cross, really. Just worried. She sighed. Maggie reached for her mother's hand. So sorry, Mum. It must be so hard. I wish I was here more to help. You being here now is enough. The sound of a piano, trumpet and double bass soon drifted from the house into the garden, carried on a gentle breeze. Maggie thought of her grandmother, imagining her dashing around Paris with her friends. She'd never even been to a jazz club. She took a sip of her wine and listened to the music, wishing for adventure of her own. If only she was brave enough. Chapter 3. Paris, 1961. Un crème, s'il vous plaît. The young woman looked up at the waiter, unable to keep herself from looking at him a little longer than she needed to. Thankfully, her eyes were hidden by a pair of black sunglasses, shielding them from the bright Paris sunshine. He merely nodded and turned, a perfect split-second display of Parisian insouciance. Being American, she wasn't used to it. Even New York seemed like a friendlier place than here, and that was saying something. Allegra Morgan had been in the French capital for about a week and was feeling desperately homesick. Not that she would ever admit that to her parents. As far as they were concerned, she wanted them to think she was having a marvellous time, if only to make them regret their decision to send her away so suddenly. Looking back, she knew she'd been the author of her own misfortune. She'd been on her third and final warning from the headmistress at her school back in Manhattan. Deciding to skip class to go and meet her boyfriend, the one her parents had forbidden her to see, hadn't been the best decision she'd ever made. And it definitely hadn't helped that the person who'd caught them sitting under a tree with a half-drunk bottle of bourbon beside them was her own mother. What Allegra hadn't anticipated was being sent to another country to stop her from seeing that boyfriend ever again. But in their wisdom, that's what her parents had decided was best. Allegra was shipped off to Paris at just 18 years of age to learn French at an expensive language school before she caused them any further embarrassment. Her mother was quite the socialite with a spotless reputation, their Upper East Side apartment frequently filled with a great...